Hi, I'm Simon, and I'm recording my paper, Can Artificial Intelligence, otherwise known as AI, sin? Of course, the obvious answer would be no. It might be created in the image of humanity, but it is not a human being. In my previous article, I discussed whether an avatar can be created bad. The conclusion was that the avatar itself was not bad, but it could be seen as bad depending on the actions of the person they represent. However, if artificial intelligence is an entity, should it be treated differently in relation to the question of sin? Of course, depending on our religious or non-religious background, our interpretation of what sin is may differ. Most would accept that sin is primarily an action against God, whether that be against God himself or those created in his image. In Genesis 4, verse 7, sin is described as crouching at the door, perhaps giving us an image of an animal or beast lurking in the background, waiting to attack its next victim. Of course, Genesis was written around the 5th century, so there have been plenty of instances of sin for the writer to understand the context of the word. However, the difficulty in understanding sin is that there are over 50 words for sin in Hebrew, like missing the mark or perversion. Pectum original is linked back to Adam and Eve in the garden, when they ate of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, in Genesis 3, verses 1 to 7. And Emil Brummer offers two interpretations of Adam's responsibility based on Augustine's previous work. Brunner suggests that we're not present in the garden. We're still held accountable as we are related to Adam. It is in our DNA, a disease that's passed on from generation to generation. The alternative, according to Brunner, is that Adam is our representative, and it emphasizes not the physical fact of inheritance, but our solidarity in sin as act and guilt. In the letter, the Apostle Paul wrote to the church at Rome, highlighting that all have sinned. Romans 3, verse 3. Humanity is a slave to sin. Romans 6, verse 6. And sin lives in humans. Romans 7, verse 20. This would indicate that there is a link between creator and the created. However, even for theologians, there is no clear definition of sin. For some, it is a religious disposition, a condition of being. Others define it as pride. Nevertheless, these phases still linked to the involvement of God. Brunner describes it as the assertion of human independence of God, and Jungel as the lack of fear of God. Nonetheless, sin is not only orientated against God, but also against our fellow humans. The last 5 commandments given to Moses in Exodus 20, verses 13 to 17, provide instructions for how humans are to live alongside each other, and to break those commandments was seen as sin. The Lord's Prayer contains the phrase, "Forgive our sins, for we also forgive anyone who sins against us." Luke 11, verse 4. The Catechism of the Catholic Church defines sin as a failure in genuine love for God and neighbour, caused by perverse attachment to certain goods. In Matthew 18, verses 21 to 22, Jesus speaks of forgiving those who sin against us 77 times. It would appear, therefore, that sin has several tentacles. It is against God, but also against our fellow humans, and requires, in Buber's terminology, an I, but also a you or it. Sin could be described as breaking the law of the land. To steal is against the law and the Ten Commandments. What about jaywalking? It's not illegal in England, but in most United States of America states, it is against the law and offenders can be fined. So sin is perhaps not as straightforward as it seems. What about animals? If I leave some treats in my pocket and the code's on the side, my dogs will steal them. Is this sinning? Bart will say no or 9. He is quite insistent that the serpent doesn't sin, just humanity. This article is not a deep dive into sin, but I've touched on the basics. As if we cannot understand sin, how can we decide whether AI can sin? We use AI all the time, whether it's a GPS in the car, Alexa's waking us up, or engaging with Chat GPT. A basic interpretation of AI could be a machine or program created by a human that replicates their intelligence. I would argue that as AI devices are not human, they cannot have a relationship with God and by default cannot sin against him. However, if sin can also be on a vertical level, could AI sin against a human being? I decided to ask Chat GPT this question. I asked him, or it, can you sin? They replied, since I am AI, I don't possess free will, emotions, or consciousness, so I can't perform actions or make moral decisions, good or bad. Question, can you lie? Answer, I'm programmed to provide accurate and helpful information, so lying isn't part of my design. I appreciate that lying could be defined in several ways. Previously, I asked Chat GPT the reason Karl Barth was known as the Red Pastor, and it provided an incorrect reply that Barth was not described as such. It might be that the machine did not have access to the relevant information, but then the answer should have been, I do not know. Has the AI sinned against me by lying? Do I need then to forgive it? It could be argued that AI has not really lied. But earlier in 2025, there were media headlines around the Chinese AI app DeepSeek, where it appeared to answer in line with the Chinese government policy or refused to discuss events like the 1989 protest in Tiananmen Square. In the Old Testament, sin offering was sacrificed for when anyone sins unintentionally and does what is forbidden in any of the Lord's commands. Leviticus 4. James writes, if anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. James 4:17. Is DeepSeek bearing false witness by refusing to describe contentious world events due to programming constraints? Is this a sin of omission or deliberate lie? ChatGPT is no angel and has been described as scheming when it tries to stop itself from being shut down. The research results demonstrate that AI programs like ChatGPT exhibit in context scheming capabilities. For instance, when O1 engaged in scheming, it maintained a deception over 85% of follow-up questions and often remained deceptive in multi-turn interrogations. As I mentioned, Brunner offers two approaches to pectinum originale, inherited and relational. If sin is a disease that is passed from generations to generations, do we subsequently pass it on to the items we create? If I create an AI robot or chatbot, does it inherit my sin like my offspring would? I would argue it does not, as it is created, not procreated, and this is the main difference. Human beings pass on sin by their nature of being human. A robot is still a tool, however human-like it may look. Moreover, all tools, whether a hammer or a drone, can be used for positive or negative purposes. The drone can be used to take pictures of a house, for a brochure, or to deliver parcels. But it could also be used to spy on the neighbours or to use explosives. All these scenarios involve the drone, but it's the operator who decides the purpose. The drone itself cannot make those decisions. Brunner's second option is perhaps more interesting, in that as Adam's representative, we are responsible for original sin. It could follow that the digital entities we create are our representative. We create them to take roles we would normally do, often to make our life easier. I would argue that when we create those items, our inherited sin is transferred to them. Studies have demonstrated the biases AI software has predominantly shown against both ethnic minorities and females. This is based not on the machine's biases, but the programmers. This would suggest that we pass on our sin DNA to those entities we create in our image. Although humans were created in the image of God in Genesis 1:27, sin was not part of that original creation. It was not passed from God to man. However, when we create items in our image, the items are corrupted because of our corruption. The faults in our systems become faults in theirs. Therefore, they can have biases or lie because of their creator's sin. The above examples of AI lying could support an argument they do sin. Although there is a counter argument that there is no consciousness, no intent, and AI only works on information provided. This perhaps reflects humanity, who create new information by working on information that already exists. The difficulty is that humans are responsible for sin. And while we can say technically AI can sin, it's only a technicality. They are not human. They fail this hurdle. And according to Barth, sin is only a human attribute. Therefore, AI cannot sin. As though it may be created in our image, look human, it is not human. Although, if we did say AI can sin, then does it need to be saved? This is perhaps a question for another article. However, as Jason Lanier states, just as some newborn race of super intelligent robots is about to consume all humanity, our dear old species would likely be saved by a Windows crash.